Hello all. And so to recap and to continue on with Deleuze's philosophy, in our last video we left off in the middle of logic of sense, but for the purposes of someone just clicking on this video for the first time, I'm going to somewhat recap a little bit and say that Deleuze is trying to set out what sense actually is in relation to propositions and accounting for how sense is this sort of liquid way of seeing how it gets away from propositions and forces them into paradoxes and contradiction. And so he has these different series of paradoxes and dualities that's going to play into his actual structure of why sense is so different than past propositional and logical structures before it. And so one of the distinctions, of course, is between bodies, which are embodied in the corporeal sense, and this in distinct difference from the duality of sense effects or events proper. And so you have a duality of things on one hand, the material singularity as he's described, against language propositions as seen with the Stoics. And so sense hovers between these two dualities. And so in one series of meaning and how bodies interact, such as now if we're moving to Lewis Carroll now and the Alice novels, the body has these two real distinctions in its state of affairs of consumption, which reminds me of Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy of this world is almost like a hell where you're consuming the flesh and bodies of things smaller than you in order to sustain yourself, in order to express your own will into the world. That kind of similar distinction here could perhaps said of the eating of words and the use of words in language and its signification. Because of course with Schopenhauer, the aesthetic arrest is what pushes us up to the highest ideals of humanity, where of course on the contrast you're just consuming and just eating bodies, living this hedonistic hellscape, as Schopenhauer would probably say. But before going off the rails, I also want to say perhaps something that could help with when Deleuze talks about words, as we'll get into, and these sort of different meanings. There's a sort of a pop reference, really, I'd like to add, of the double entendre in hip-hop, where lyrics can sound similar or have different meanings to them despite how they might appear at that time or how they are even given. And so you have a sort of multiplicity there. And so that could be helpful in how to look at that as opposed to assuming you've read Alice in Wonderland or know about James Joyce and the portmanteau words. But anyway, continuing on, I digress. And so in the Alice comparison, we're talking of the eating of the word, the logos, in the old Judeo tradition of the interior of the word and the consumption of the scroll, and how enlightenment and knowledge is given in the act of eating. And of course this is passed down to the Christian of the eating of the body of Christ, which allows us for the scholastics to have access to the discourse of God's knowledge and its path forward, where for Alice and the depths, the ironies, for Lewis Carroll, and social gaffes and the mistakes of depth perception, this moves up through the body to the surface of things, which is of course the language and stuttering and gaffes across as the words glide across the surfaces of the spoken. And this, of course, is to point out that sense does not exist outside of linguistic proposition, although it is attributed to the states of affairs. And so the event subsists in language as it happens to things similar to a coin, really, where you flip one end and sense kind of is in both the realm of things, of states of affairs between bodies, in the realm of propositions and sense articulation between language and bodies. And so the two folds of articulation, the causal states of affairs between bodies, but also the proposition and their aspects of denotation and expressive. And so the denotative characteristics are that of substance and contingency. Verbs then are the sense, even in and of itself. And so propositions has a duality of denotation and expression, or the sense. And so we find the duality within the proposition itself, as Lewis Carroll says in the series of eating and the other series of references to sense expression. And so you can have these different meanings here, such as how the mouse explains what it is to the duck, it being for the mouse in the state of affairs of the significance of William the Conqueror being advisable as the new leader, or to take the crown, if you will. Whereas the duck is denotative on it being these different bodies of consumption, as we've referred to earlier. And so there's different meanings of significance between William the Conqueror and the crown and it. And so eating as consumption, and animals consuming things, that sort of state of affair. But there's also the expressions and meanings and significance as well. And so Lewis Carroll points out what the characters think they see in his stories but they're kind of have this nightmarish significance with these characters as they're haunted, and so they're looking at material or absurd objects, or making them absurd objects, because there's a meaning within those material objects, even though it isn't materially actually identified. And so continuing on then, his fifth series of sense, continuing with his paradoxes, there's the paradox internal to sense, which is not identical to the actual propositions that sense is contained in. And so the first paradox that he wants to point out is the one of infinite regress. So every proposition cannot contain the sense that presupposes as a proposition. And so the state of affairs, or the denotatives, puts you always, as you're doing that act of denotating, into a new proposition to make sense in this sort of infinite regressive series. And so this leads into the paradox of dry reiteration, where you're trying to capture the sense effect by creating a double proposition to extract sense, but then of course you have a doubling that reiterates the prior proposition. And so continuing to the third then, which is a very complicated one, it's the third paradox of neutrality. And so sense then, he wants to say, is neutral. The essence or sense with regards to the opposing categories that are put forth to it in propositions, sense is completely different from these predicated logical systems that make of sense, and it's separate from denotation and signification, and so this makes it really neutral even to the classic Kantian categories that make propositions and thinking possible. For Deleuze, as he says, an animal is still an animal, even though in something like the classification of modality is, where you're talking of, is this particular, is this a singular, or is this, something that's a universal? Ultimately, that doesn't matter because the animal is still an animal, and so trying to draw a distinction there, sense the sense of the animal is totally indifferent to the categories that propositions force sense into. So sense is separate from propositions, and thus making it neutral to the denotation and signification. And so continuing on, he then wants to talk of absurd objects, such as the squared circle. These are the impossible objects. They are outside of being because they cannot be in actual states of affairs. They can't, be. And so they can't exist well, actually they do exist independent of truth, because you can't make a truth and false applications to it because it isn't materially existently possible. And so those categories that comprise that don't apply to absurd objects, such as the perpetual motion machine. These have separate categories, as is the case with the squared circle. He's trying to point out that these things aren't actually real, or they actually are real despite not actually being real. Sorry, I slipped up there. And so serialization, the sixth series, when we have a series of infinite regress, when considered in the succession of names and its subordination by degree or classification of rank. And if we consider it in its sense of double articulation, every series then has two avenues or two prongs to make use of these two denotative series and other sense series. And so each name that is denotatively expressed, the sense of the previous name in that double aspect. And so this is how you end up with heterogeneity, or a series that is comprised into one. And so the two series of events or propositions and the two series of states of affairs could appear homogeneous in their categories and might be similar in how they're classified, but they are different, and this isn't an arbitrary difference between the signifier and the signified. So general law that relates to series, and so the other series is the signified sense, and the signified contains the denoted object in propositions, such as who is uttering. The signifies that are a priori for any truth proposition, and all others are denotated in Deleuze's classifications. So the signifier is always contained with what is sense expressed in a series. The signified contains the previous three. So there's this hidden fourth element here. Of course, the previous three being manifestation, signification, and denotation. But ultimately, this, again, doesn't get the fluidity that sense is. And so two series, one signifier series and one signified series, such as the example of a literary series, or the relation to the hero archetypes in mythical stories, and how Joseph Campbell has that sort of structure of these different archetypes. There's these plugins, these structures of the hero, of the signified structures that are plugged in, and then of course the sense or the expression is put into the signifier. And so you have that with a literary series with a character who's based off of another character prior, or a sort of repetition, if you will. They have those relationship with the signified structure and to the signifier. So the signifier is always a part of that which is expressed for Deleuze. He wants to really hone in on that. And so the three characters of relations between the two series he focuses on. And the first classification is the law of displacement. And this is a sort of slippery, gliding that just glides off and can't be really accounted for in the series, in the structure. And so the second characteristic, the signifier series, has an excess within it that is asymmetrical. And so we must have more signifiers than signifieds. So this, of course, creates a disequilibrium, this is, of course, a very important thing to understand here with Deleuze, with the lack and the lack of signifieds and the excess of the signifiers. And so the third character of series relationship is the paradox between the back and forth of the series that creates an excess or lack of. And so this could be seen perhaps in Alice, who's looking up at the shelves, and as she's doing that, the prior shelf that she had focused on before vanishes away. And it's similar to how dreams work, where you focus, or in this case with Alice and her peripheries, she focuses on a top shelf of signifiers, and thus she has a lack of signifieds on the bottom shelf as it goes out of focus, similar to dreams where you're trying to get context, or with how memory, you could say, is sort of cyclical. You're trying to reaccount things, and so as you're focusing on it, paradoxically, other elements of it go away in the context. And so the signifiers is the excess, or those, the toy shelf, and the signifieds is the example really of the lack of in the below shelf as it disappears away for Alice. And so every focus, just like in the logic of accounting for memories or dreams or the past, and its focus on peripherals, and this is really the case of art and dreaming, and how it's demonstrated in its laws, really. And so another example really is the letter which Lacan talked of in the Poe story, where you have the series of the king, queen, and minister. The king is not aware of the letter that the queen has put out in plain sight, which she's, of course, proud that it is out in plain sight despite the king not knowing. Whereas, of course, the minister, who knows all, lets the letter stay in plain sight to be then found by Dupin, who knows all, and so the two series connects by the object through the letter. And so if we were going to do a little recap here of where we're headed so far, Deleuze makes the distinction through the Stoics in his reading of the difference between effects and causal effects, which are identified with states of bodies or events or propositions about events. And the duality is to the causes of being identified as states of affairs amongst the bodies themselves. And so the Stoics, that's how they were really looking at the paradox of sense historically. And so Deleuze says, on the outside events and states of affairs, there is that classification, but that the surface of propositions themselves, and so the interior of the proposition actually has distinctions between expression and denotation. And then the other distinction between the actual proposition to the states of affairs, or the denotated object that the proposition is referring to. So yeah, there's an interior classification eternalized within propositions themselves between expression and denotation. And so Deleuze has this hidden fourth element, which of course is sense, such as the three dimensions of propositions that go from denotation to manifestation to the signified, where sense becomes this hidden fourth dimension, and the structure of sense itself is classified within the four paradoxes of infinite regress in a signified chain, and the propositions clarify the last one in that example of dry iteration, and then of course the doubling from effect taken from the cause, which creates a double proposition. And so sense's structure is within that. And so the paradox of neutrality, sense is distinguished from the Kantian quality, quantity, relation, and modality, which of course conditions propositions. And so sense has to be neutral in order for that to be. And so the structure of series in the signifier and signified is similar to that of the paradox structure, but of course sense is coming at this from a different angle. So that's a rough upshot, really. And now we want to continue to the seventh series, which is focused on esoteric words. And so Lewis Carroll uses esoteric words in a methodology of how he connects heterogeneous series together. And so what are these heterogeneous series? So the first type of series is two events, but they have slight eternal, usually in the case of the cyclist here, a temporal difference, but they are ultimately connected in strange ways, or the absurd strange object even. And so the cyclist example is, there's two successive accidents, which of course has a temporal difference, but they're connected with the clock with 8 hands, and he cannot even tell time, and in fact time actually goes after the clock, and so this of course jumbles the temporal sequence in the story. And so the two successive accidents for the cyclist is connected by the ways of the strange object that connects the series together. And so the second then is a classification of two series that have large differences, but the differences connect from set propositions, or they have a similar cadence in its similarities, such as the example of onomatopoeia, where you have these two series that sound similar, but they're actually different. This is the case with the word there. And so third series is the two heterogeneous series that differ greatly, but they're actually made into an assemblage, if you will, by the use of esoteric words. And so the distinction between the different esoteric words are ones of contractive, circulating, and portmanteau. And so the first two types of words really correspond to the connective and conjunctive synthesis, whereas the portmanteau is the disjunctive. And if you're familiar with anti-Oedipus, then these terms appear here, but in a very different way. This is just esoteric words, whereas in anti-Oedipus, it's more in a really an account of consistency. Okay, so the contractive esoteric word, like the sort of mashing together of Your Royal Highness, which is supposed to be this sort of unpronounceable syllable that contracts together. So the syllables are connective in the connective synthesis to create a single word, whereas the conjunctive synthesis are two separate heterogeneous series, such as the abridging of snark together with the characteristics of the snake and the shark as a conjunction synthesis, which coexists within the two series. But The fourth series, which is the more interesting and complex one, is the portmanteau words, which are infinitely ramified from the portmanteau word as it differs from other esoteric words in its capacity of combining them to ramify different meanings indefinitely, such as the example of the word frumious, which is the combination of furious and fuming as a disjunctive synthesis. But nonetheless, if you lean towards furious, they are furious frumious, but in the case of the latter, then they are fuming frumious. And so frumious then is a sort of perfect balance between this disjunctive synthesis that brings both into a single series that ramifies that series that's similar. And so this is really a calling, actually this is going to lead to really the rhizomatic idea of assemblages, of connecting, or one of the properties of assemblages, as they'll get into in the different planes in 1,000 plateaus, is that they connect and ramify indefinitely, and they connect at any point, any inflection really, and such is the case with these esoteric words in their meanings, at least, to where they just connect at a totally random series, and so you don't necessarily need similarity, you actually need a difference to make sense of that, which of course is what he's trying to undermine in the philosophical tradition. But continuing on to the eighth series of structure, he wants to focus on the paradox with Levi Strauss. And so for any two series of a signified chain to the signifier, where there is always an excess signifying chain over the lack, but for Deleuze, in the signified language has to be given all at once, therefore meaning that all of the differential relations of the signifieds are already presupposed within language. Language is a totality of a signified chain, but what we know is the signified in the process of unfolding knowledge, even though paradoxically language gives us the signified chain all at once, making an excess of signifiers and the lack of them as well. And so now he's focusing on how much we actually know in that relationship to language and its presuppositions for what we'll get into with the blank space. One can think of perhaps in the comparison to Robinson Crusoe, who wants to reconfigure society. So he's presupposing all laws at once as a sum total, such as the arborescent model or the overcoding tyrannical structure. Whereas meanwhile, for Crusoe and his known signifieds, as he's uncovering knowledge in his conquering of the island, he's uncovering the known elements to map onto the signified chains. But we always have more signifiers than signifieds to latch onto. And so law presupposes this totality regardless of what is specifically known or signifieds, which makes for really the recipe for the cake of revolution, if you will. This is how revolutions are made possible for Deleuze, because there's this gap between the signifier and signified. And so there's this revolution, this sort of tension here between what he would call the authoritarian structure that assumes, it has all knowledge of things in culture and society, even though it is an ongoing process to obtain all knowledge. And so there's also this interesting aspect that Deleuze talks about where the technocratic or or the technics will always sign with the establishment, as opposed to the revolutionary, which of course Deleuze is interested in. And so the Strauss paradox of the signified chain to the signifier is then in the floating signifier within that signified chain, which guarantees the production of art and culture and really cosmology. So in the signified chain, there is the floating signifier given onto by the signified chain itself. And so the floated signified is an empty spot or an excess of the signified chain. And you can kind of perhaps think of the two blank pieces on a domino side, or the free space in a game. There's this sort of vacancy here, this no quality zone, if you will. And so cosmologies are not possible without this excess blank. There has to be this space without an occupant in the signifying chain, whereas in the signified, this suffers from a lack and doesn't have a place. So there's an excess and a lack here between the relationship of the signifier and the signified in its chain. And so this asymmetry created the constant operation of the it, or the gadget, or the whatchamacallit for Strauss. And so this indeterminacy allows the system to function in its possibilities. And so the floated signified that's given to the signified by the signifying chain is ultimately what Deleuze really bases much of his cosmology on, and how we actually operate to fill this vacancy, or to have this difference, if you will, or rupture. And so he wants to look at these three minimal conditions, continuing on then, for a structure. And so we can't have a structure without two heteroseries. And so the conditions within the two must have a series of events or historics that give way to singularities. So there's a call really to chronos, the god, or chronological structuring here that ultimately will be able to place where novelty and singularity arises. And so a cosmology of novelties or ruptures of the status quo is going to be of interest again to Badiou in his event ontology and event in being. And so each system then has its own history, its own genealogy, and events and the singularities must be accounted for within it. And so the third condition must eventually converge on what he calls the paradoxical differentiator. And so this corresponds to the empty blank space, the empty domino, if you will, that ensures an excess of signifiers within the signifying system, and always a lack of signifieds within it. And so the system produces an occupant without a place. And so this is embodied really with the thermodynamic state of imbalance to being, since the mapping of the signified chain never completely charts the territory of knowledge given. And so such is the example historically, of course, of Christianity, going across the globe. The signifieds of Christianity, forming new assemblages, such as with the Native Americans, the Aztecs. There's a recoding, a new map that has to be translated, and of course, the repetitious Christian pre-given signifiers. And so if we have an access, then, of course, which is a given, we'll have a new cosmology of this unmapped zone that Deleuze says is really the conditions for how you end up with novelties in culture, which is very fascinating to me. Anyway, continuing to the ninth series, And so what is the event as a singularity? What is the ideal event, he wants to ask. So the event is a series of singularities or points, or a state of affairs, even, or the example of a psychological situation, and how the event corresponds to chaos theory or systems theory. There's a sort of inflection point that Deleuze really wants to hone in on here, where the properties are through the event, through the ontology of something like the cutting with the Stoics, through that rupture, you have to reconfigure the entire system, because it's no longer the same, as is the case with singularity ruptures, which of course is connected to the event. And so, just as the example with the bubbling of water, the Bernard cells, which form hexagons, and so this is the inflection point really of the event that starts the boiling or bifurcation that introduces a new set of conditions that ultimately changes how it's systematized forever. And so event as singularity doesn't have to do with propositions in the classics of denotation, manifestation, or signification. It has to do entirely with the dimension of sense. And so the event is a particular turning point that changes the system or grounds the rules, where, as Deleuze sees this as something pulled apart, and of course there's the psychoanalytic aspect to this all, with Guattari, as we'll get into in those classics, where you have the multi-egoic personality now, and so Deleuze kind of thinks that the human subject can actually be totally consumed within the event, whereas very late postmodern thinking today, such as with the influence of Badiou and Zizek, they're trying to actually reattain subjectivity, and so the event becomes one of those ways in Deleuze's philosophy here to try to recapture that. Of course, for Badiou, it's in fidelity to truth, politics, art, and love, as we'll get into with him. But of course, the event for Deleuze, it can destroy subjectivity, and so the event is always an ideation and realized in the concrete states of affairs. And so this creates accidents, as seen with Stoic surface effects of these events. And so there's a universal characteristic, which is the same with the ion God, or the flipping, really, as Deleuze famously puts it, of Platonism here, where the universal character isn't actually in form and in being, but it's actually in these effects, in difference, and so the essences are actually through the effects. And so accidents are realized then by way of circumstance. And this perhaps we could set along with Virilio and his accident ontology. The accident replaces the event for Virilio, where you have this chronos of culture and technology, that's changing a civilization, as it's being inferred, as it's progressing, if you will, where Virilio is going to say that no, this is actually random occurrences, these accidents. There's no place in history. There's no event status any longer, and so the changing of the system, events are random and accidental then. But continuing with Deleuze, he's going to say the proper mode for the realization of events is in the problematic. And so he's taking this idea from mathematics, of course, because mathematics is of course about problematization, but he draws a distinction between the Neo-Platonic idea of theorematic geometry, where theorematic geometry defines the attributes from essences, whereas problematic geometry has to do with effects that manipulates geometric outcomes, something like the rules for a game, if you will, as we'll get into later. And so events are in the mode of the problematic and are distributed in singularities in these set points in a series framed by a question that is itself from a random point or aleatory point. But the question corresponds to the empty blank space of the signifying chain that ensured that the surplus chain over the signified. And so the signified, the element that forms the problem or the question inside the problematic that has to be resolved, but the solution, of course, never maps on directly. And so this makes a continuum or a process of differences. And so this is really getting into the meat of his cosmology now. And so in his classification of human events, he sees human events that they should be characterized by their problematization. And so Deleuze, in a similar way to the human psyche, to how the mathematic procedure problematizes the psyche, is put to points where you can have a depressive state or something that causes a phase change, such as anger or perhaps someone who's bipolar, who has this sort of erratic changing of mental states. And so then you have the changing of the dynamics of problems, or the problematic. And so continuing on, then Deleuze wants to discuss what is the ideal game. And so he wants to draw the distinction between the gods of Chronos and Ion as these two separate games, but ultimately are a single manifestation of one ideal game, where, as it turns out, Ion's going to be this ideal player. But continuing with Carroll in the novel, Carroll portrayed games really as nonsensical. There's no rules or objectives. There's no winners or losers. It starts and ends. There's no real measurement of the throws, as we'll get into. And so this, of course, is not for Carroll, he's not exactly the example of the kind of games that we encounter. So Deleuze wants to ask, what are the conditions of the ideal game, or the anti-game, even for, as it turned out for Lewis Carroll. And so he defines these four characteristics. The first, of course, being to define distinct rules that precede the game, in order to make intelligible, really, the rules and conditions to be able to have chance, or the portion of chance and how it will unfold. And of course, games require, to some degree, skill or knowledge, but nonetheless, how it's inframed within the rule structure gives portion to chance, or its limitations. And so while there is skill involved, ultimately you're trying to make conducive the probability, or, well, in this case, the possibilities of what the dimension of chance actually means for the game. And so third, there's a certain number of throws, whether you actually have a numeric amount or it's zero. It doesn't matter. All that matters is there is throws to be had. And then fourth is to win or lose. And so all games have these similar characteristics in their functions, but if we undid them to try to find, what is the pure, or the Carroll, or for Carroll, the anti-game. And so, what is it without rules, and what if we could have chance infinitely given. And so, thirdly, there is no numerical number of throws in the anti-game, although qualitatively they are different. Each have a new set of rules, though, in that difference, and so this changes the distribution of points, or for how singularities or events are intelligible then, if each throw has such a differentiation, if you will. And then fourth, of course, that there are no winners or losers. And so Deleuze, quite somewhat beautiful way, puts that man or God can play this ideal game, but since it's a nonsensical object, and so just like with the squared circle, we can think of and thus use as a sort of mirror, a projection into human thinking or philosophy even, and seeing how works of art and truth systems create rules and singularities for those rules to be given. And so as the example with the throwing of a dice, where someone tries to blow onto it to create a force to continue the iteration of the dice roll, you're changing the possibilities in an unfair way. You're changing the rubric of chance by infusing your own rules. And if we suppose that this is infinitely done, where chance isn't just a single outcome, but throughout the system. And so we return again to really that Stoic distinction, that duality, which then is now fleshed to chronos and aion. Chronos being proper to causes, the states of affairs between bodies, and then of course the aion God is of surface effects for the Stoics, and the pure surface events or effects in their actual purity as the ideal player, as we'll get into. So there's two different types of temporality. There's the chronological emphasis, the one that he's been picking apart, that the logical inference on the present, and so the past is of course behind and the future in front, and so the present is privileged, and thus, even though it's governed by the eternal return by repetition, because it's recycling into the present, so nonetheless, the present is privileged in this form of temporality. Whereas the aion form, the unlimited, the proceeding on the straight, Faustian, if you will, perpetual line that goes on infinitum. This is of aion, which is infinitely subdivided, and so by doing this, what's tied to the future and the past in its division effaces the present, because ultimately this subdividing of the past, or the splitting of the past and the present, effaces the present as such. And so events are always realized in this chronos accidental, or causes that happen to bodies and to people. Whereas the realm of events, or the essences, things, have already happened in the aion realm. And so if they've already happened, then of course they're about to happen. And so they're therefore not in this process. They're just the realm of pure effects. And so they're about to or haven't, and of course then if what's started and is ending is about to start again, and that sort of eternal return form. And so of course this is divisible then in the aion line of the future and the past. And so the aion is the ideal player whose rules in his infinite in his properties of the infinite line ruptures all the other game rules prior. And so his cosmology really can be imagining of, two gaming tables side by side, where Chronos is the state of affairs, and the other table as propositions or surface effects, and Ion is the border between what makes sense, the coin flip, if you will, the double side that's has a place in both, and infinitely penetrates the two gaming tables together. Just as with sense, as the border between propositions and attributes of bodies and things we can say, and the denotative and sense of what actually happens to bodies. This sort of distinction there could, it fits across with his conception of the Ion. And so the Chronos realm of the eternal returning or repetition is of infinite regress and conventions and states of affairs of bodies and its attributes of bodies, versus the Ionic realm, the realm of pure of events and effects and propositions about body, where time is infinitely divisible in the realm of Ion, in which the present isn't emphasized for, and instead the realm of effects, where a priori and posteriori realms are taking into one essentialized realm, of course, as we've talked about with what is about to end has already begun, and what has begun is about to end. But yeah, this is really the structure of sense for Deleuze, and ultimately what he uses to set up his Chronos and Ionic distinction for his cosmology, which of course is very fascinating and influential, that he's built out of the material sciences in his day. And so that's really the rough upshot and the rough details of the logic of sense. And now we're going to be setting the table for 1,000 Plateaus to see the full maturation of those ideas in The Body Without Organs and his collaboration with Felix Guattari. But this is a very long video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, and hope to see you guys like, comment, and subscribe. And yeah, I'll see you for the next one.